One is one of three, one is one of one. And these are for context, so it's not necessarily that we're bringing them up as the discussion comes. I'm giving you a handout, and they're for context. Well, they're coming. Yeah, they're coming along. You just happen to be down at that end, way down there. Hello! There's two things. One says E-BART, one says Jacksonville. I hope so.
How many do you have here?
So you take one of those.
Okay, you got two.
No, no, no.
No, and one.
Okay, so give me one back.
I'm gonna give you one back so you can give it to whoever's right back.
Yeah. Whoever's up next shows up. There we go.
What, we weren't even expecting to have everybody here.
No, forgot how many. Okay, everyone, happy holidays to you. Welcome to coming to the State Route 85 Corridor Policy Advisory Board meeting of December the 10th, 2018. And I will call this to order. Could I have a roll call, please?
Yes. Member Warren?
Here.
Member Sinks?
Here.
Member Bruins?
Yeah.
Member Sale?
Here?
Member Turner? Alternate Member Craig? Member Jimenez? Member Klein?
Here.
Vice Chairperson Miller? Chairperson Powell?
Here.
You have a quorum.
Excellent. That's a great way to start. It's been a while since we've gotten together again, but this is nice. We haven't met in a while, and so I particularly wanted to get this meeting going so that we could get our juices flowing again, thinking of where we're going. We have a new member every now and then. Welcome aboard. And there's been a lot going on since we last met, not necessarily in the direction that people thought, but we are getting background information. We are getting financial information. We have received some funding. And today we're going to sort of get a little bit of an overview of where we're at, where we're going, and ideas that will get us thinking of when the money is approved and we continue with the study, that we've sort of leaped ahead a little bit. We're going into our third year on this particular project, and to some we haven't accomplished much, but I think it's just a slow process of we had to work it out, get everybody sort of thinking what we're doing, and our final objective is to get a transit system down 85 that moves bodies. I don't know how many, who took 85 this morning to get here at all? I know I did too. Okay, so it was what, 9:30, 9:40? And I was coming up from Mountain View and it was backed up all the way to De Anza Boulevard. So okay, so we have some public, so we're going to do a roll call. We're going to do a couple of presentations. This allows the public to speak for 2 minutes to talk about anything that is not on our agenda. The committee, if committee action is requested, the matter can be placed on a subsequent agenda. All statements that require a response will be referred to staff for reply in writing. So I guess we're going to start off with Roberta. If you could come up and speak for us, please. And our clerk will take the time. She will keep an eye out for her after 2 minutes.
Good morning, Chair and Council committee members. I'm Roberta Holloman. I'm representing the League of Women Voters of Cupertino, Sunnyvale. And yes, this has been a very long process. We started a study of Highway 85 before it was built. We came up with a position that included retaining the median for some form of public transit, preferably rail. And I have been following this all these years and years and years. And now that you finally are through with the lawsuit, you have the money, I hope you make up for the lost time that we have had. Thank you.
The next speaker will be Jim.
Hi, Jim Stallman. I live in Saratoga. Last week's VTA Board of Directors meeting had a mention that the 85 Hot is in final design. That was in print. And
Okay, so if you're going to talk about item SR 85, we do have a item number 7 on the regular agenda. So if you wanted to talk about SR 85 then, The hut? Hot. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, HOT. Final design, and I would have thought this policy advisory board would have had a look at that, or at least something like this would be visible to the public. There was some good outreach and presentation on 87, 280, 101, 85. You know, Larry Klein's got that pedestrian overcrossing with a pylon that's not in the center of the right-of-way of the corridor. That's a major reason for your big bottleneck. And just be curious, you know, sometimes things get missed, and have a look at that thing and provide some review, input perhaps. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, then next after that, we'll go with Nancy.
Hi, I'm Nancy Fimble. I am the president of the homeowners association called Cypress Point Woods, which has one of its borders at 85. We have been very concerned over the years. We're a 40-year-old complex, and we have been very concerned over the years with the noise level along 85. We're well aware of the report that's online that suggests that in the fall there was supposed to be the beginning of some pilot experiments that would try different treatments to lower the decibel level at the homes that back up to 85. And I don't see any discussion of that in recent agendas, and I'm wondering where that stands and whether or not the issue of noise has been lost given the problems of congestion instead.
Okay, thank you. Okay, after saying that, anybody else would like to speak? Okay, let's bring that back to the board. Any orders of the day? Oh, we do have one more? Oh, Connie, I'm sorry. Sorry about that.
Thank you, and happy holidays to all of you as well. My name is Connie Cunningham. I'm a citizen of Cupertino. And I had a couple of things that I wanted to say. One was thank you for your service on a policy advisory board. It's obviously very necessary for our area. Two things. I was very interested in the Mountain View result of the election where the tax was approved so that the large companies would be helping with traffic problems. In Cupertino, ours didn't go out to the public, but instead we did get a public-private partnership with Apple, so that's very exciting as well. What I would like to suggest to each of you as council members is in your own councils to put a standing agenda item where you talk about the status of traffic so that it doesn't become like kind of lost into what's going on. It's something that everybody is extremely interested in, and I think it would go a long way to mitigating some of the issues that people have, thinking that nothing is being done. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Just to let you know that the Measure P in Mountain View passed by 71.5%, so that gives us some money, extra money for our transit. A lot of naysayers were going to say that companies will leave Mountain View, but right after that vote, it wasn't much later, a week or two later, that Google invested $1 billion, I say with a B, in Mountain View and bought land there in the same North Bay Shore area. So that sort of tells that they're going to be there for a while. Okay. Anybody else would like to speak at this opportunity? Okay, we will go to orders of the day. Do I see any change in orders of the day from our board members here? Seeing none, we will go then ahead and receive a committee staff report.
I have no committee staff report today.
I'm sorry?
I have no committee staff report today.
Okay. Then we have two consent items. Approve the regular meetings of February the 26th and the regular meeting of May the 21st. Do I have any corrections to the minutes? Second. Okay, we have a motion. Okay. Does anybody from the community have any comments on our minutes or corrections? Seeing none, we have a motion by Director Bruin, seconded by Director Klein. All in favor? Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, Motion passes unanimously. Okay, well, we'll go now to item number 7, presentation on State 85 Transit Guideway Study Status. And this is what we've been waiting for. So, please, go ahead.
Okay, I am Adam Berger. I'm a senior transportation planner at VTA and the project manager for this effort. I want to give you an update on our study status, talk about some of the developments that have happened since our last meeting, and do a little bit of review of where we've been and where we're going on this project. The first big update is that we've had progress in the lawsuit against 2016 Measure B. Another favorable court decision has come to VTA, and the plaintiff in the lawsuit has chosen to appeal the appellate court decision to the state Supreme Court. That occurred in early December, and that started a 60-day timeline in which the state Supreme Court can decide if they want to consider this appeal or not. If they need extra time to make that consideration, they can extend their 60 days up to 90 days total. But we should have their decision by the end of January or end of February. If they choose not to hear this, I think the plaintiff is out of options at that point. If they do choose to hear the case, then we could be looking at a year or two of more waiting in the court system, although VTA will do what it can to prioritize this on the court's agenda given the public interest. So if Measure B funds come through, that will mean that you will not just be seeing me at your meetings, but you may also be seeing updates on the noise abatement effort that previous speaker mentioned. There are 5 pilot projects that are ready to go, just waiting on Measure B revenue to make those happen. They were adopted in VTA's 18-19 budget, so they are already programmed, just waiting for the lawsuit to resolve. Even though we are waiting on Measure B, this committee has been very clear about seeking other sources of money, and we have been successful in getting a $1.2 million loan approved by MTC. Now, it is a long and complex process to make that happen. I had to use over 30 acronyms on this slide just to document it, but it's conversations between VTA, MTC, the Federal Highways Administration, and Caltrans, which is their representative in this decision, to just make sure everybody agrees that this is an acceptable use of federal funds that will be reprogrammed. The process by which that happens is that in the end of this year, early next year, MTC will go through a reprogramming process where they will take funds that could have been used elsewhere but have not been and give them to VTA because we clearly have a use, and we'll just wait for a number of steps to administratively to occur before we can get our hands on that money. But we think this process will give us access to those funds at some point in the first quarter of 2019. So that's very exciting for project progress. So a little bit of review. We are basically done with the first phase of this study. That was a look at what the travel market is on Highway 85, what we think the transit market will be, as well as an analysis of constraints along the corridor that might influence the sort of designs that we pursue. There are a number of findings here. I've listed a few high-level ones on this slide. All of our findings will be documented in a report that you'll receive once we start phase 2. It'll be a refresher of where we've been, and also if we have any new members on the PAB, it'll help them hit the ground running. So we've been doing all that we can to stand on the phase 1 side of the line and peer into phase 2, talking about project process. That'll be the theme today. We'll be thinking about even more possibilities for Highway 85 and what these could be. When we get to our next meeting, hopefully we'll have the funding cleared at that point, and we'll be able to do more of a workshop-style meeting between staff and the Policy Advisory Board, where we may sketch out some ideas, and staff is planning to sort of jumpstart that discussion with some basic concepts that we can work off of as we come up with our project alternatives to be studied. Once we have those project alternatives identified, we will start an alternatives analysis, which will be a technical analysis conducted by VTA staff and our consultant project team. We'll be looking at all sorts of benefits of the alternatives, increased ridership, decreased vehicle miles traveled, less traffic, faster speeds, all the things that we would like to see in a successful project. We'll also be looking at a number of difficulties we may face, any sort of feasibility issues or impacts that projects may have, and we'll be looking at the capital and operating costs of the different scenarios. That work will culminate in a report that we'll provide to the Policy Advisory Board and the public, which will also be boiled down into a matrix that will compare all of the projects. We will have a community engagement round after that. If you recall, our first round was sort of a blank canvas, ask the public, what could we do to make Highway 85 better? And we received a few thousand points of input on what we could do. For the second round, the question will be more pointed. We'll show them all of the alternatives and the metrics that we've figured out for them, ask them which of the alternatives they feel is the right direction for VTA to pursue on this project, and we'll also be asking people specifics about how their personal commute would be changed if they could use a transit option on the corridor. I think at that point, we'll go from people imagining a stress-free transit ride to actually penciling out how long it would take them to get there by various modes, and we'll get a more realistic or accurate sense of how successful a transit service on the corridor could be. So upon completion of the community engagement round, it'll be the responsibility of the Policy Advisory Board to make a recommendation to VTA's Board of Directors about how to proceed with an investment decision in this corridor, and that will wrap up the Transit Guideway Study. So this is my last slide. I'm happy to take any questions on this item.
Council, questions, the board directors? Director Sinks.
Thank you very much. So we thought we were doing something good back in April when, I talked to Dave Cortese and said, can you help us get some funding? So my understanding is that Measure A 2000 funds were used to fund phase 1 of the study. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And so in theory, the board could have allocated more Measure A funding, but they chose not to do that, correct?
They chose to pursue an MTC loan.
Right. And now an MTC loan, all these months later, it's going to take nearly a year to see that process through, as we now understand, correct?
We're waiting on the reprogramming process they do annually. So we're held to that timeline.
Wow. It's a stunningly long process. It's amazing how when powers that be want to move things forward, they can do so fairly quickly, and when they don't, we wind up with this bureaucracy that doesn't really get us anywhere. Now, what happens if within 60 days the Supreme Court says, no, they are not going to hear the case? Does that immediately release funding to all of the Measure B projects?
My understanding is that there will be a short period after such a decision where the administrative work will be done to release those funds from where they're currently being held in an escrow account. I believe that'll be a short amount of time. I don't have a precise amount of time for that, but at that point we should be able to use those funds.
So for the study that we're talking about here, would we continue to pursue the loan, or would we drop it at that point?
You know,
We would take the fastest route possible.
That's a good answer.
Good answer. Yes.
Thank you very much.
That is the correct-
Okay. Meaning we would drop, should the Measure B funding come through first, we would drop the loan.
If that's the fastest
that's
route
the fastest.
possible.
Right. Good. Okay. Thank you. With respect to the statement in the staff report, corporate shuttles are more plentiful in the northern end of the corridor, but VTA was unable to gain any information about how many passengers they carry. Now, in our February meeting, we had a wonderful discussion about corporate shuttles. You presented some very interesting information that was the result of setting up video cameras at overpasses along the freeway. We did get some good information. We speculated on ridership, right? It was also said that we had asked questions of employers through employer groups and others, but we had not gotten answers. The business community got into a hissy fit, to put it shortly, right? We had tweets from the Bay Area Council and Silicon Valley Leadership Group about this. If we're serious about really understanding potential ridership, should we continue to ask these questions and ask for answers? And I say this particularly in light of the fact that, as John indicated, when my city council was considering a head tax at the end of July, the day before Apple came in and said something they'd not said in the 3 years prior negotiation. No, we want to help you with, and we want to work with the city council. We want to work with VTA on transit in this corridor. I think it would be time to call them on it, meaning ask again, can we get information about your ridership in these shuttles? I mean, we do need to come up with some practical solutions that work for major employers, I believe, as well as modest-sized employers. I think about, you know, our school districts. Their employees need service. And if we understood how these functioning corporate networks were working, it might really help us design a solution that could help them as well as everybody else, particularly if we could adopt, you know, riding temporarily before we have any permanent facility built, something going up a shoulder, whatever. But I would like to see VTA ask those questions again and be transparent about the answers we're getting or we're not getting. And I'd like to call our employers and say, hey, you said you wanted to help. Help us. Help us design a solution that works for everybody. Or let's be clear that you don't want to do that. But we're almost a year later. We've had to suspend this study for lack of, frankly, in the scheme of things, very little funding. It was a nice gesture on the part of Dave Cortese to try to move this thing forward, but as a matter of bureaucracy, we're stuck in the slow lane still on this project. And I think I don't know, have you had any further data or interaction with our major employers since we had that discussion last February?
We have not received any input on ridership on corporate shuttles.
Have we asked?
We asked twice, initial question and then a follow-up through the employer groups.
What were those dates roughly? Which months?
Oh, November 2017-ish.
Okay. Well, my request through the chair would be that we continue asking and that we bring back the requests and responses to this policy advisory board.
Director Sinks, just to give you some information from what we're doing in Mountain View, we have continued to have our discussions with Google and the TMA. So I don't know if Cupertino has developed a TMA, Transit Management Association, within Google and some of the other employers, but we're constantly looking for them to get that. We have a particular policy in Mountain View that there's a single ridership occupancy going into North Bayshore. So they've reached the cap in Mountain View, so Google will be constrained from what they can develop unless they meet the cap. But I see a tipping point in the way of corporate shuttles are willing to start to discuss options to them, because Google does not want to be in the transit. None of these guys want to be in a transit system. And that's why here's an opportunity for our board and the VTA and any organizations to step up and say, here's solutions, and reach out and talk to these guys. And they are more, in Mountain View, they're more receptive to do that.
That's great.
And in Sunnyvale, I know that since Google is bleeding over into Sunnyvale, or conquering Sunnyvale, whatever, depending how you look at it, that it's also broadening their desire to get express or out of the shuttle system.
Well, all the more reason that our transit agency ought to have.
Well, they are looking
as
to
much
us
data as possible,
because we
right?
probably have better contact because we deal with their government relations people,
Yeah.
and that's a great source of information and persuasion. So that's how we're doing it in Mountain View. So maybe you should continue those conversations with them because they will look to you. My belief is that major corporations will have more. Our elected officials will have more credibility and more responsiveness from corporates than they would from VTA, because we're in a position to help control things. So we have to work with VTA to get those questions asked and answered. But we are moving forward, and as I say, again, the tipping point is in our favor, because, again, they are losing employees because of the transit, they're losing employees because of the housing costs, so we'll just continue working with them.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Oh.
Oh, yeah, go ahead. Director Waterman?
Sir?
jumping right in. Yeah, I mean, so this one's kind of pointed at, there's been a lot of headlines in the last few days, as I'm sure you know. It says here VTA's $25 million deficit could lead to service cuts, et cetera. Now, for those of us in the West Valley cities, which doesn't include Cupertino, because those of us in Los Gatos, Campbell, Saratoga, and we don't have giant companies. We probably, I'm not sure any of us even have medium-sized companies. We have trouble getting service from buses or anything at all, even trying to get light rail extended. And when we see things like that, we've all been talking about, it's kind of code for your already not so good service is going to get cut. So the question is going to be, how is that going to, do you see that affecting this at all, the cutbacks, or is this kind of a side issue and you'll go on to help out our friends in Sunnyvale, Mountain View, and Cupertino, and it's kind of going to be more focused on that? Is there any ideas with these cuts where the focus is going to be? Because it sounds like you're not going to be able to do everything you wanted from way back when.
So this is my other project at VTA, the service plan for the next network. So, yes.
Director Waterman, that's a very important issue, but it's not necessarily on our topic, so could we bring that up?
You can bring it up anytime you want. Okay.
Let's get through that, and then, because yes, but the SR 87 study will be pertinent to what we're going to be doing later on. So if you could just hold on to that. Director Bruins?
Yeah, I wanted to piggyback onto something that Director Sinks mentioned. In terms of the employers and such, I don't know if we've done it yet or not, but I would encourage us to take advantage of their new person, Jason Baker, who, you know, has sat on VTA, has been an elected. He may bring a different point of view and also may be in a position where he might be able to help broker some information, because I think sometimes the barriers tend to be what people perceive we are trying to get, the information we're trying to get, versus what we actually need to get, which are not necessarily the worst case scenario for them. So I would encourage you, as Mr. Sinks has said, to look at taking advantage of the new player on the block there. I know I've talked with Jason about this and have encouraged him to reach out and help us figure out some sort of compromise so we can understand this. And I want to say thank you. Yeah, the MTC process is a long process, but it fits into a lot of other things. And so I do appreciate the answer to the same question that I was going to ask, which is, you know, what happens? And I think the answer, got the answer that I wanted to hear, whatever gets us moving faster. My understanding in terms of Measure B, should the court decide not to hear this item, it's probably 30 to 40 days to actually be able to start accessing the funds. So, which in the grand scheme of things, for as long as we've waited, 30 to 40 days, I think is reasonable. And so I think all of us should send positive vibes that this will not be heard by the Supreme Court.
Do I have any other questions? Yes.
Just a follow-up request to what Chair McAllister had asked. If you could provide the 2 rounds of questions that you have asked employers, so that we as elected officials can then follow up with the corporations in our own jurisdictions. I think what you brought up was a valid point, in that if they understand that not only VTA but their elected officials are asking, then that silence might come to bear. I know we've had several conversations with Netflix, but if I had a better sense of what questions you were asking, I could tag on to those conversations as well.
Sure. We have all the emails that we've sent them recorded, and we can share that with the Policy Advisory Board, perhaps through the board office.
That would be, I think that's an excellent suggestion.
Works to have the same questions. Any questions from this side of the? Okay, we do have a member of the community. Connie would like to speak on item 7.
Okay, when I first saw this, I wasn't sure that we would be getting all this information, so I guess many of my questions have been answered. I just don't remember hearing when phase 1, 2, and 3 would be starting and when that next community, feedback would be requested. If I missed it, if you could please let me know.
So you were referring to the chart of the funding process?
Not the funding process. I think that got answered pretty well. I'm talking about phase 1 of the study, phase 2 of the study, and phase 3, and then it says community engagement round 2. And I didn't hear whether there was a statement of when these things would be completed and when that community engagement round 2 would happen.
Well, the short answer is until we get funding, that will once decide how things start moving along.
Okay, maybe just how long would it take after you got the funding?
Well, it took us 3 years to get to this point, so I hate to tell you how long it would take once to get going after that.
Well,
So again, wait a minute, so once again.
But
we're at the end, we finished phase 1 more or less, right?
Phase 1.
And now we're gonna start
Phase
two.
1 has been completed. Phase 2 and Phase 3 are contingent upon the availability of funds. The funds we're pursuing 2 paths concurrently, although Measure B is still tied up in the court system, okay? So until that happens, again, I think to repeat what staff said, the Supreme Court has 60 days. And we're doing everything in our power to get that to happen shorter than 60 days. Once we get notified by the Supreme Court, then it's a 30 to 40-day process before we can actually get access to the funds. So once we have access to the funds, staff, I think, already has a timeline. It's just a matter, that first point in the timeline is unknown until dollars are available. The second path we're also pursuing, in parallel to the Measure B release of funds, is trying to go after money from MTC, and that's kind of a little bit longer cycle.
Right.
So until that, we don't know.
Thank you very much for that input. I was thinking more about how long does
Hey, Connie?
phase 2 take and how long does
Connie?
phase 3 take? That's all. But I'm done.
You could probably ask offline on
Yeah,
that.
that's a good idea.
He could be glad to answer your questions for
Okay.
that one.
Thanks a lot.
Okay. Seeing no further questions from the board on item 7, we will go to item 8. And before you begin on item 8, present on reversible lanes in other cities and potential applications of State Route 85, Howard, the vice chair, and I were talking about ways to try to get a distinct focus. As this board gathers today, I want you to start looking at potential opportunities and being realistic about what we're going to be able to do in a short time. I know a lot of us will be coming off the council in a couple of years, and we've been at it for 3 years, and we'd like to see something started within our terms here. And so the KISS system, it works, keep it simple, is that if we can focus on trying to maintain an approach that will get us service quickly but still protects the right-of-way. And Howard and I, the vice chair and I, came up with a one-sentence paragraph, you might say, and keep it, and is it?
The fact that he let me write it means we're in trouble.
Yeah. We discussed it, he put it into words. Develop a transit plan using existing right-of-way / medium / shoulders that maximize ridership by maximizing speed, minimizing stops and delay. The measure is serving the greatest number of likely riders based on big data analysis. So just give that a chance to mull over, and when we go through some of these things, think of what we're trying to accomplish. And I think our process may flow a little bit easier as we go forward with that. So, Aaron, please.
So.
I know, I always call him Aaron because
It was
your
Andy
brother
last
looks like
week,
Aaron.
So I had prepared for this item thinking that we were going to talk about reversible lanes. And it sounds from your statement that you just read that you're thinking more about making the best transit service possible within the corridor, the guideway that we have. So a little bit of a disconnect with this next item, but it may be helpful to go through it anyway for 2 reasons. One, reversible lanes are an interesting idea for Highway 85, and also in 2016 the state passed legislation saying that any changes to a state-operated highway corridor should look at reversible lanes in the project development process. So whether that was known or not, we are satisfying that requirement by looking at this now. Also wanted to talk a little bit about the reversible lane idea in terms of the traffic volumes that we see today. So let me explain this chart that you're looking at. 3 travel lanes in each direction on Highway 85 could, at the optimal travel speeds around 40 miles per hour, carry about 2,000 cars per lane per hour, so 6,000 in total for the corridor. What we see, however, in the peak direction is that since speeds are well below 40 miles per hour in the 10 to 20 range, that we're coming in well under the actual maximal efficiency for the roadway. A little over 5,000 cars per hour in the peak direction. In off-peak, we're a little over 3,000 cars per hour. So thinking about a reversible lane concept, it does look like the math works out to endorse this sort of idea, that there is an extra lane of capacity that could be taken away from the off-peak direction and given to the peak direction to move more vehicles in that corridor per hour. I will say that that's where the ease of this idea ends, and there are a number of challenges that come along with this analysis. So I'm going to talk about a few reversible lane situations or conditions that we see around briefly, and then apply that thinking to Highway 85. The first on the Golden Gate Bridge, this is the ideal of simplicity for this kind of solution in my mind. It is a movable barrier with a zipper machine that allows in one pass across the bridge to switch where the lanes are. You can do it while cars are driving on the roadway with minimal impacts to the freeway operation. The reason I say that this is a very attractive, simple solution is that the bridge is all one span. It is connected northbound and southbound. There is no gap in between like you see on the new portion of the New Bay Bridge, or even some sections of Highway 85 where the northbound and southbound sections of the roadway are on separate structures. Also, the supports for the bridge are on the outside. That is very different from Highway 85, where every single bridge along our corridor, and there are over 20 of them, have a support in the median of the roadway, making a service or a treatment like this difficult. I've also looked at the Chicago Skyway. This is Interstate 90 going from downtown Chicago to the northwest. It has general purpose lanes on the outside with 2 lanes on the inside that are reversible, traveling toward Chicago in the morning, downtown Chicago in the morning, and away in the evening. Access to those lanes is controlled by gates that are located just on the outside of those lanes. Again, you see that the supports for the bridge are built into the outside of those lanes so that there's a nice space for 2 lanes to travel through at a high speed safely. They control access by using these gates. This is the closed condition, and this is the open condition. And the thing that I really want to draw your attention to here is this lane in which the photo is taken is particularly wide. And this is not part of the general purpose lanes that are and drawn in diagram form here with the transition lanes shown in gold. You see that this takes up a very large portion of right-of-way. And when I look at this, I think about how one of those lanes is always going to be closed because it is discouraging cars from entering from that one direction, and that it may be more likely that if we were to just use that space where it exists to build additional lane capacity, you could probably reach greater throughput, or if you were to use that space for a transit lane, it might be better than having one of 2 lanes always closed. The last example I want to look at is I-15 in San Diego, sort of a combination of those two, and the commonality that it has with Highway 85 is that this median right-of-way was initially set aside for a light rail extension. After the highway portion had been built, the powers that be decided that they did not want to extend light rail in that corridor, but rather turn it into an express lane. Carpools eligible for free, solo drivers have to pay using a fast track type transponder. And this also features the movable barrier in the middle, so they can adjust between an even 2 and 2 or a 3 and 1 configuration to maximize the throughput in that corridor. Again, pointing out the issue with the access lanes. There's a lot of gray on this slide, so I've colorized it for you. Light blue on the outside are the general purpose lanes. The red is the access lane, and the gray are the taper areas separating the two. And also on Highway 15, all the supports are built into the median barriers that divide the reversible lanes from the outside lanes. That's all I have on this item. Happy to take any questions.
Do I have any questions from the board? Director Sinks.
Thank you. So if we made this a transit-only lane and we had rules of operation that all the drivers well-trained would adhere to, would that simplify the amount or reduce the amount of extra width needed to accommodate entering such lanes? I mean, if we had a scheme where in the morning there was a dedicated lane for buses, not general purpose, not an express lane, but specifically for buses to transit north, and we were able to carve that out of existing real estate. And in the afternoon, that lane would turn into a southbound transit lane. Would that simplify things?
There would be a challenge of how that lane would go through underpasses, potentially, given the current pillars located in the median. Those are engineering things that can be resolved, although perhaps at a significant cost and some construction disruption. I'd have to think more about the specific design to give you some solid feedback on that. In the next presentation, we're going to be talking about bus treatments on highways that may show some examples that are relevant to what you're thinking about, and perhaps we can use those as a jumping off point for further discussion.
Well, I would surely be interested in understanding, without major realignment of pillars, whether we could carve, and with the existing real estate, or if in a short span we would have to go up, so be it. But how would we, with minimal expense, carve out?
Director Speak, I failed to mention that we do have a representative from Caltrans here,
Okay.
and he may be answer those questions better for us than, and so if we could have him.
Okay.
Could you come up and introduce? Yeah.
So Nick Saleh is with us. He's the District 4 Division Chief. And also, before Nick gets up here, point out that one of our earlier deliverables was a constraints analysis for this corridor, where we had an engineering firm look at what it would take to fit a transit lane in the form of light rail and bus into the corridor, an additional lane. We can bring those back to you or resend it out through the...
So as I recall, that was a study for 2 lanes, and if the question got down to 1 lane, would it make it easier or not? Thank you.
I'll let Nick tackle that.
Good morning. I'm Nick Saleh from District 4. How you doing? Happy holidays. Actually, the new district director and the chief, we have a holiday open house in Oakland, so they couldn't be here. But anyway, just to answer a quick answer to your question, I'm not sure the depth of details you want. It just, regardless of what lane you need to have reversible or transit only, you need to satisfy all the safety, geometric, and mainly the access points, and in case there is an incident happening between, how you're going to deal with it. So this is regardless of how many lanes, or reversible or transit only, we need to consider those facts in doing so. And actually, I remember the statement you guys made about the reversible side. It looks like it could be a purpose and need statement from Howard and John. It depends what you need to accomplish with any, revised geometric in the highway. And actually, you do need to have treated as a separate project. You need to look at it from details, from, just different angles, from actually maintenance, safety, geometric, and as Adam says, with those overpasses in between, what is the best fit for this kind of proposal.
Thank you. No, since it sounds like it's a complex area, I'd, through the chair, be interested in having this looked at the right time.
I was going to make it simpler. Stay up here, please. Howard, you have a question for him?
Maybe for both, but when I look at the corridor, we already know that we have the right-of-way and the space to add a lane from 87 to 280. So I would imagine that wouldn't bother with the whole reversible structure. The reversible structure would be from 280 to 101 would be the zone where that would apply.
Yep.
In that zone, there are six structures with center pillars. I don't know how many actual pillars there are. Four of them are actual roadway overpasses, and 2 of them are pedestrian overpasses. But I'm gathering that is really the zone that would be reversible, and there would be a transition somewhere between, around 237, and another one that would happen somewhere around 280. And then the rest of the guideway, we can add in the transit-only lanes between 87 and 280. So Adam kind of presented like we were looking at reversible on the whole thing. So I would just like to point out that I think it's a hybrid reversible. The second question which I have, we did a right-of-way study as part of phase one.
Yes.
And it was unclear to me out of that right-of-way study how much space we had. Right? It seemed like that study came back that there was some stuff that we were going to have to do to widen, and there were some parks and stuff that we were going to impact, but there was potentially enough space to put 2 lanes in there. Am I misreading the right-of-way study?
Oh, no, go.
You are correct that there would be room for 2 lanes. In the part of 280, or part of 85 north of 280, it would be a very tight squeeze with potentially some right-of-way impacts on the sides of the corridors. Also, it was likely that I think at least 2 interchanges or overpasses would have to have their designs modified to accommodate that space. But we could squeeze it in there with a bus alternative requiring less space than a light rail alternative.
Yeah, so that was really kind of where I was going, just trying to be practical. The whole reversible discussion has merit if there's not space. And,
Right.
and I hear squeeze and I hear other terms, but if there is space, is that viable? Or are you saying, yeah, for $80 billion, we can build enough stuff to make enough space? I mean, how possible is it that it would be that we could build 2 travel directions north of 280? That's really the question.
The question is, can we use the shoulder and transition that to a
Well, I
transit?
don't know what's needed.
Well, that's why we have.
Or could we, instead of going under, could we go up, as in a flyover that would also allow for a stop?
Yeah, without trying to get into too many exact details, but to just,
Yeah?
we did a right-of-way study, and we get an answer back, and it's less black and white than I would like, and maybe that's just the nature of it, and I apologize to the professionals, but from where I sit, I would love for you to say, yes, definitely the most cost-effective way we could add space out there is to add another lane in both directions. Or, no, there's a bunch of things wrapped up in this right-of-way study that says that would be really prohibitive, and so a reversible lane would be a preferred engineering and cost solution.
So,
This is a great discussion leading into phase 2, where we actually select alternatives to
Right.
analyze. This would be a good candidate for that.
but let's have, if the Caltrans gentleman could answer the question, how can we use the shoulder and so forth? Because I will transition that as, there's an article in the San Jose Mercury from November 6th, is using shoulder a traffic solution? And I'm sure you guys have been asked about it. San Diego has a study. So maybe you could tell us, give us your input of what's required to be, or be able to use, or what are the concerns from Caltrans about using the shoulder and transitioning that into a transit lane?
Actually, the recent few years, we do have few pilot projects in the district that actually allow the use of part-time shoulder use. Currently, there is a study going on in Contra Costa for 680. They're trying also to maximize the use of the shoulder part-time. The current legislation actually only authorizes the public transit to use the shoulder. This is the legislation. And it does require a lot of constraint and training for this public transit. But again, it just Caltrans, we are open to this one. We have a lot of projects. We've been approached a lot from the locals. And matter of fact, 87 actually, I think it has some of the initial feasibility study. So Caltrans open to this one, but we need to look at it as a project that is a viable and a safe project that actually will help the region without an adverse impact to the general purpose lanes and the public safety.
But by law, that's only public buses?
I understand this is exactly, yes, public transit
I didn't
only.
think that was even a possibility, but has state law changed recently?
Well, we'll get into, yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead. So there's pending legislation?
Well, I don't know. No, I don't know. I don't know.
I realize this is agenda item number 9,
existing,
right?
yeah.
So.
Well, no, this is sort of the reversible lane, I would say.
So we do, oh, no, I'm talking about the shoulder.
The shoulder, yeah.
Yeah. So Caltrans will do this one, and we need to treat it as a project. We need to study again, because keep in mind, you're taking some of that safety feature from the highway, at least part of the day or most of the day. Now, how you going to deal with the other emergencies? I want to make sure also the use of shoulder are, because the moment you allow the shoulder to be used, you treat it as a lane, so it has to comply with all the safety component of public safety and the engineering aspect of it.
So I understand there's been pushback from the CHP?
You know, I remember something was mentioned in this body of this meeting a couple of years ago from VTA. This is what I've been told. But I think it's the legislation to allow everybody else to use the, yeah.
Okay,
all the public.
yeah. So you have, Chris, you read this article, and do you have any comments on it?
I've read it and I don't have any comments on it.
Okay, Jeannie, Director Bruins?
So just trying to stay with the reversible lane part of this presentation. Just a couple of things. One is I agree with, you know, I think as we move forward, I think we're going to have to try and figure out how to keep a manageable scope on this project. There's, you know, there's all kinds of different things we could and should and might be able to do, but I'm more in line with Director Miller in terms of when we look at the 85 corridor and we look at a reversible lanes. I have two caveats on this. One is I am interested in doing it where we don't have available real estate, where it might be a solution. Yeah. And so I really look at this as being from 280 going north up toward 101 in Mountain View as the piece that should be looking at it. I, in my humble opinion, I think it's a waste of time and money and energy to look at a reversible lane from 280 south, okay? So that's A. B, I'm looking, and I'm gonna say this very strongly, I am looking for a transit-only lane, okay? So if north of 280, if that means it's a reversible lane, but it's only for multi-axle vehicles, the buses, and again, for me, the shuttle buses and the public transit buses are fine, okay? And then south, when we look at this, when we look at that whole express lane, I am looking for one of those lanes. The added lane in the median is going to be transit only. I am at the point now where I believe public transportation is not going to be viable if we cannot have the political will to figure out how to make buses more than just competitive. I mean, they've got to beat the automobile. No one's going to get out of their car if you have, on the other end, you don't have your car. So we have to really be looking at this. So I'm going to be saying when we move into phase 2, how do we kind of narrow some of this down? I'm actually, you know, I'm also at the point now, sorry guys, but I'm at the point I don't even want to look at fixed rail. You know, I'm not sure fixed rail is the right solution going forward. I think when we look at having these dedicated lanes for your transit, and you look going forward where you're going to end up with, hopefully some point, autonomous buses that kind of connect. You know, when I was in Europe, it was the trains that were doing it. The buses are going to be doing it sometime, okay? And they're cheaper to operate. You know, you get onto a train and you know that you need to be in the first X number of cars because at some point there's going to be a station where the back half of the train will disconnect and you're, you know, if you want to go this direction, you're going to be in the front end of that train. If you're going to go the other direction, you're going to be in the back half of that train. But it decouples without you ever moving, right? So I think we've got to be designing this thing, I think, with more flexibility and where we're going to have sometime down the road, don't know if it'll be in our lifetimes or not, folks up here, but, you know, where we do have autonomous rubber tire vehicles. So I'm all for the reversible lane, but I think we need to just, let's not spend all this money trying to look at it where we don't need it, and let's not look at designing these things where we're assuming an automobile's going in there. I really would like to say I want a dedicated guideway for transit type vehicles.
I think there's pretty much concurrence on that. So, yes, 85 north of 280 would be the way to do it. And what sort of triggered my thought on this was I was driving along and there was construction on Fremont Boulevard and 280 where they did take the lane and they shifted it over to the left so that they could do an update on the on-ramp at Fremont and 85. And I said, wait a minute, we could do that. So I go, okay, let's do the rest of it. So my question is also, I was talking to some directors on the Golden Gate Transit System, and they were talking about how they changed the widths of the lanes. And so they had the outside lane, which was for buses and trucks, was at 12 or 11. But as you came in, they narrowed it so that they could do that movable lane. So what is the requirement on the width of a lane?
Actually, the federal requirement is 12 foot per lane. And any deviation from this 12 feet, it needs to be analyzed and have, they call it design exception, what it means. You know, I think a geometrician and an engineer could look at it and evaluate. There is no safety concern. So, but we've done it everywhere, and it's doable. We need just to look at it, make sure this is the right thing to do. So
the process would, this board would say, hey, we recommend to make this, from VTA staff says, okay, hey, we can make it work, but you just got to make some lanes a little bit narrower so that we can get around the bridge or the overpass if we had to. And then they would submit it to you, and then you guys would look at the project, say still safety, and then it would.
Yes.
Would the CHP review any of these projects with concerning the lane narrowing or?
No, that design, well, I think the concept will be, it's a good idea, that because you've taken some of their local jurisdiction too, which is in case a shoulder or something else, but usually that's a lane width, it's a Caltrans signature.
You're the signature. You can do it. Okay.
And that's why I said we'll work with VTA, and this is one aspect of it, that exception of the width, but there could be another safety, and you could concern, and you could mitigate for some of the stuff. So that's why you need to look at it from complete picture
Okay.
or whatever proposed.
Yes. Director Klein?
Yes, as far as the Contra Costa shoulder pilot, what's the timing of that? What's the time frame for results and, you know?
I believe I will give you more details. I haven't think it's deep enough to understand, but they start with the feasibility or a concept, what we call the project study report, so you understand, you analyze all this concern, and you do highlight all the constraints that you need to analyze down the road during the design of the project.
Okay.
But I believe it's going to start with called project study report that actually gives you the scope of that study.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
Yeah. So I'm in agreement that it only makes sense to look at, if we're going to look at something, we look at the constraints on the real estate north of 280. Maybe a reversible lane makes sense. I'd just like to make us, as we're thinking about this, it's not simply moving a transit-only guideway through the corridor. We have to have a stop or two or three, right? So we have to, as I'm thinking about this, if I fly up to an overpass and I have a stop there, well, a bus then comes back and right, it could take any of the lanes. The problem is, well, how does it stop then? So I think we have to think through the implication of, what is it, how would we get the infrastructure to load and unload frankly, in both directions, right? So.
And so that's where big data would come along, and I've already talked to staff about looking at data based on where vehicles come on and where they go. And they gave us a preliminary study showing the color chart where that flows. And so once we get into our study and develop it, we have the data to say, okay, here's the points where we want to put the stops along the way. But again, back to Howard's and I thought process that we want to minimize stops. And so the data will say, here's the collection points. This will maximize the directions. Any other questions?
No, just the point
go.
that we have to think about infrastructure so that people can get on and get off quickly.
Right.
And let that vehicle keep moving as a BRT system would, right?
So also.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm just going to read a short part of this. Next year, the California Transit Association, along with Valley Transportation Authority, the Contra Costa Transportation Authority, and other planning groups will seek statewide legislation to bring this one unthinkable practice to everyday commutes, and that is using the shoulder. Highway 87 through San Jose is one of the items. And that's when I read the report, because it came to the VTA board, and I said, hey, can we potentially join in on, and Director Bruins and I both recommended to the VTA board, can we piggyback on the efforts to use the shoulder on Highway 87 to also apply to Highway 85 shoulders and so forth like that. So is there any little bit of a background that you can let this board know about the 87 study that I've read about it, but maybe the board hasn't, that would be similar to what we're trying to accomplish?
Actually, the study was done just like recently with VTA. So there's, I think there has different component of potential ideas, but I will let Chris or Adam speak into that.
Some of the ideas we studied on 87 could be applicable to 85 corridor.
At the same time to 85, well, we have to have a study to prove it though.
Yeah, and the reason I say that is because the 87 corridor study looked at a lot more than just reversible lanes. It looked at a whole bunch of multimodal solutions.
The reversible lane also, but use of the shoulder.
Correct.
Yeah, okay. Any other questions from any of the board on this? Okay, so.
Can I just
yeah, go ahead.
One aspect of the reversible side, lanes, it just actually does come with a maintenance and a daily maintenance if somebody gonna, the picture was showing the gates or something. So it does actually, it has exclusive and designated maintenance staff. They need to take care of this in case there is a requirement to reverse or remove barrier as in the Golden Gate Bridge. And I think also in San Diego, it does actually require a designated crew to do certain things. And actually it adds up to the cost of any proposed.
One last question. So a lot of the projects are pilot projects. So you're saying, are you sort of implying that in the future they don't necessarily have to be a pilot project, that they could be a regular process that we go to Caltrain and say this is what we want to do?
Well, actually, the pilot projects usually they set it up for 2-3 years, for five years, and they monitor the safety aspect of it or some criteria that actually concern and the pavement and all this kind of stuff. And if it seems to be a viable option and it has no safety concern in the long run, then it becomes could be permanent feature.
So would you recommend that if we were to go down this path, that we would ask for a pilot project first?
Actually, all the shoulder use project at this time, it's our pilot projects. So it needs to be a constant evaluation of the performance of these things. But that's a good approach too.
Then what about the reversible lane?
It could be pilot. I mean, it could be actually permanent if it needs to be studied anyway, make sure this is the right project.
Okay, but Caltrans is open to...
The reversible, it doesn't require any legislation or anything. I just want to clear this. Only the shoulder use, it does actually has legislation aspect of it. But the reversible lane, it's a project by itself, and if it's done right, it could be permanent.
Okay. I want to make sure the board understands our options on this, because this could be a major direction we're going. So, any questions from anyone? Okay. Thank you. Appreciate you coming out on a big day up in Oakland that you came to visit us. We appreciate that. So any other questions on item number 8? Because we do have Stephen would like to talk on item 8, please.
Thank you. As Mr. Berger said, at 40 miles per hour, a lane can carry 2,000 cars, but that doesn't mean that a Highway 85 corridor carry 2,000 cars for one additional lane, because most people don't use the Highway 85 corridor from one end to the other end. They use it for a short bit somewhere along the way. For example, if you're going from from Campbell to Cupertino City Hall, you're not using the whole corridor. So in fact, one lane will have way more than 2,000 vehicles in an hour, and each vehicle has more than one person on average. So you're actually handling a lot more people than the 2,000. So don't think you only have 2,000 more people if you add a lane for free flow car use. And you cannot get that kind of capacity by any kind of transit you're going to come up with. People you're dealing in past concepts, and you got to think the future, and the future is autonomous vehicles, but including cars, and includes Uber and Lyft now, and already instances in the Bay Area where transit improvements are falling short because people are using Uber and Lyft, for example, to get to airports rather than take airport transit extensions. So that's the future, and you're kind of having blind eyes towards that. There are really not enough dollars in VTA's budget to support any of these things. Not enough for $4 billion for light rail, certainly, and not enough for a $1 billion bus system either. So all this discussion of transit is sort of pie in the sky because there's no money there. And I would hope that any study that's done will include free flow lanes in it to show what the free flow lane capacity could be for a relatively small cost, including a small cost to build it could be done now. And in fact, if the shoulders could be opened, you can open them now for free flow use of cars and vehicles and see how that would improve the usage of Highway 85. So I'd really say that, you know, I heard someone here earlier talk about practicality. You guys are dealing in impracticality when you keep talking about transit. Thank you.
Thank you. Adam, did you have anything that you would like to add to the discussion so far? I might have cut you off. I apologize for that.
No, just appreciating the discussion and the clarity on a reversible transit lane. I think that's something we should probably investigate in phase 2.
Okay, seeing that, we'll move. Yeah, we're going to take you there. Okay. Question from co-chair?
Yeah, it's not so much a question, more as a comment, I think, which is there is, as noted, right, we could talk about, you know, end-to-end transportation solutions, of which there is space to add a lane. We can figure out something for the other part. But I want to make the observation that there are probably some improvements that could be made in the corridor out of a different area of the Measure B bucket, which has to do with the interchanges. And I'm assuming that's beyond the scope of this organization, but I am assuming that VTA is still considering interchange projects on Highway 85 as part of that Measure B funding?
I think there's at least one project on the list, but I'll have to confirm what the list actually is saying. There's a whole list of projects on the Measure B.
But there was some stuff around 280, 85 that I thought was...
I just don't remember them exactly what they are.
Okay, excellent, thank you.
And I'll add that the Measure B ballot language gives quite a broad leeway into how those funds can be used. While we're looking at the specific transit lane study, the first sentence talks about transit and congestion relief projects on the corridor. So potentially, given the creativity and interest, there could be other types of uses of that pot of money.
I just want for the record, I am not interested in expanding lanes and uses for automobiles, because once you give more, you never get it back. Once you give up real estate, it doesn't come back, and I really think our dollars should be spent on trying to get to the transit solutions.
Thank you. I think it's okay.
Very briefly.
Yes.
Follow-up.
Director Sinks?
My recollection is that there is funding. I'm going to look to Tim Borden back there. I believe Measure B has funding both for 85 transit as well as money for improvement of the 280-85 interchange.
But I think that's a different policy.
Yes. Well, I understand, but I mean, to the point that you know, we don't have to reprogram the 350 in order to get an improvement at.
Yeah, my comment was about the other bucket.
Yeah, this is a different area. So.
Thank you. Good.
Okay. Before we go on to number 9, again, a lot of you feel frustrated that we're not doing much, but during this interim, staff has been looking at other options as we've been going along. I handed you 2 handouts of different projects in different cities on different types of things. It's the EBART up in Contra Costa County and Jacksonville in Florida about how they're, so there's different transit situations up in these different areas. So this report is just going to lead right into what other cities are doing, and hopefully by listening to see what other cities are doing, we are not making their mistakes and we're learning from their best practices, and that we will be able to move forward quickly as they come to the area of the board. So go ahead, item 9.
Okay. At our last meeting, when we were talking about the potentially lengthy project process and the various complications you can get going at a large scale, the Policy Advisory Board ended on a discussion of thinking more in the direction of near-term, less complicated, more fundable projects. So this report is based in that line of discussion, looking at how different cities have used or have implemented high-speed bus transit on freeways and what we might be able to learn from those. So the first that I want to focus on is LA Metro's Silver Line. And this line is really interesting to me as a transit planner. It is really unique in the world of transit routes because it is one of the most flexible, adaptable services out there. This service spends most of its time on the I-10 and I-110 freeways. It makes a right angle going from the San Pedro Long Beach area south of downtown LA, straight north up to downtown LA, and then turns 90 degrees to go to the town of El Monte east of downtown Los Angeles. And one of the really interesting things about this route is that when it's in downtown LA, when it's in El Monte, and when it's in San Pedro, it is on local streets acting like a local bus, making stops that are about a quarter mile apart. In some cases, it's picking up a bunch of people and then heading off for a high-speed trip to downtown LA. When it is on I-10, it is in an express lane, shared traffic with other vehicles. And when it is heading toward El Monte, there's a portion called the El Monte Busway that is a unique bus-only facility. And I have to do some research on this, but it may be a reversible lane. I believe it's a single lane in a section there, but I will do some research on that. One of the other really interesting things about this route is that it has a very nice funding source, which is that it takes a lot of its operating cost and its vehicle cost from revenues that are gained from the express lanes on these facilities. There was a question earlier about how VTA's operating budget may affect service levels. If you can get an arrangement where the corridor can generate your own money, you may be able to make yourself a little bit immune from the ups and downs of an agency's operating budget, which they enjoy in this example. The other thing that's interesting about the Silver Line is when it is on a freeway facility, it has some pretty significant infrastructure. Mostly almost rail-like infrastructure, as you see with these stations. Here's a view of the Harbor Gateway station. The bus pulls into the median, very much like a rail station, all-door boarding, and then they go up or down to connect to the surface level to go make other connections, or they can go up multiple floors and catch the green light rail line. So this is integrated into the local network. Another one to highlight is what Seattle has done. They have a pretty expansive express bus system, more than 24 routes, many of which operate all day. And while they're given the title of express bus, they really take a different approach to what VTA does with its express bus system. These are not just commuter-oriented peak period services. A lot of them operate at pretty good frequencies all throughout the day and are really high-speed links in their network. There are 2 routes that operate here on this section of I-405, routes 532 and 535. 532 is a peak period only service. It connects the outlying Everett area with the area of high demand in Bellevue. The 535 service partially overlaps with it in the higher demand section, providing all-day service. So it really is a commuter and all-day network hybrid. We are looking here at the 128th Street overpass of I-405, and one of the interesting things about this is that Seattle has gotten pretty creative about how to fit bus stops into its existing network. This interchange has direct connect to the HOV express lanes in the center of the corridor. Those ramps are for carpool vehicles, but they have also fit in bus stops on each side of the northbound approach here. The next slide will zoom right down to the center of that overpass and look northward. You can see how the bus stop is just right on the side of the highway. So minimal inconvenience for the bus to come off, pick people up. It does have to go through a stoplight, but should signal priority be installed in a situation like this, you could really minimize that delay once boarding is complete. But not all stations are so grand. This is an on-ramp heading onto I-405, and they've built just a standard bus shelter adjacent to a park and ride with a not too glamorous opening in the chain link fence, but a budget-conscious approach to be certain. And the last example that I want to talk about is one that we see in Denver, really on Highway 36 between Boulder and Denver, where there is quite a growing travel demand coming into Denver. They wanted to address that demand by expanding the freeway, but also do it in ways that discourage solo driving. So the additional lane that they built is an express lane, a managed lane with dynamic tolling that controls or incentivizes people to use or not use solo vehicles. And they've also put what they call the Flatiron Flyer. And this is one of the most complex transit routes I've ever seen, considering that it just follows one single route between Boulder and downtown. There are 7 overlapping services, all with unique stop patterns, some that make as low as 1 trip a day and others that make trips every 15 minutes throughout the day. This is quite a bit of creativity on their part and very uniquely attuned to the travel market that they see. They've also gone in a more budget-conscious direction. Mostly they have just put smaller scale stations on the side of highways, generally on on-ramps here, as we see with the Table Mesa station. That larger structure in the distance is a pedestrian pathway connecting to a park and ride on the other side of the freeway. Another example of the Bloomfield station, where the bus actually exits from the express lane and gets over to the right lane to this bus-only space on the side of a highway, connected to a park and ride by the bridge, and picks up passengers there. So Denver's approach, lower cost and more attuned to its market. And one of the questions that we're going to be looking at, and we've already spoken a little bit about today, is the choice of bus versus rail. Measure B ballot language asks us to look at both, but one of the unique advantages of bus is that it is so much more flexible and adaptable than rail, because it can go anywhere the pavement goes. It also gives us the flexibility for different operating patterns, generally cost less, and in the right arrangement, you can actually use the same facility to generate funds for that route's operation. So that's my last slide. I'm happy to take any questions.
Any questions from the board? Well, okay. And I don't have any comment cards from the public, so thank you. Thank you for getting this done. As I say, we are working, the staff is working when we're down, finding answers, and hopefully when we do get back together, that the consensus will be, and I'm just speaking for myself so anybody can come back, that we would use shoulders, reversible north of 280, and that there be transit-only lanes, potentially for corporate buses, VTA, and maybe carpool lanes. And so that could help us if we start between now and next time that we meet, which would probably be, once we get funding, would be our potential next meeting?
Do you know what the meeting schedule is for 2019? I don't have it. That's right, so it's March.
Okay, so hopefully we'll have an idea. That offline and in between, without violating the Brown Act, people can talk and do some research so that when we reconvene, that we have a pretty good idea and that we could help staff narrow that study, which would effectively increase the time that we could get something done before we leave, if we build a consensus. Yes, Director Bruins.
So I appreciate trying to figure out, to make up kind of for the lost time, right? Because not by any fault of anybody's, but trying to narrow this down. And I think, I'm pleased with the comments from the chair and such, because I think this group, when it was first formed, was really looking at fixed rail, looking at a station every place you can imagine type of thing. And I think we've kind of matured in our own thought processes and such. And so there was a couple of other things. One is, if staff at all connected with the innovation officer, I think with LA Metro, do we have a connection with Joshua and looking at what their thoughts are in terms of how they're envisioning express lanes and how they're used as transit, et cetera?
Yeah, we do talk to LA Metro. Part of what we do in the planning group is we learn from others.
Right.
And so we are in communication with LA Metro and other properties that have similar groups.
Yeah, and so very specifically, I'm talking about Joshua, what is it, Shank, whatever. You know who I'm talking about?
Yes, I do.
Okay. So, because I think of him specifically because he comes from a think tank environment. His whole career has been that. The other thing is, I do want to go back to this whole idea of stations. I think when we look at this, as much as we always think we need to have all these stations, but every time a bus has to stop, it also detracts from its speed and its ability to be competitive and such. And I just would like us all to remember one thing. When in Caltrain's service in their history, when they had budget issues, okay, and they started looking at things, one of the things that they did that increased their ridership and reduced their cost structure and such was that whole introduction of the baby bullet. And the baby bullet is a minimum stop service. And so transit does do extremely well in minimum stop environments. It doesn't mean that we don't need the more frequent stops. It doesn't have to necessarily be as complex as what we just saw as the Flatiron Flyaway and how they're doing that. But stations are not always the right answer. And I think the other thing is as we all know, being electeds, and this whole housing crisis that exists and such, there's still a lot more of the unknowns in terms of where these housing and how housing is going to affect. And so the whole idea of staying with a flexible thing that can, the rubber tire vehicle that can move and be fluid as things start evolving, as we all start making up for, you know, the lack of housing, et cetera. I think if we keep that in mind as we even look at Highway 85, it would be beneficial.
Thank you. Director Sinks?
Yeah, I was interested just in concluding to follow up a little bit related to the remarks I made before. Given Google's interest in pursuing transit solutions, given Apple's letter to our council in July, have they engaged with you to talk about service on this corridor? Have there been any discussions yet between you all and Apple?
I'll let
I'm interested because obviously
I'll give you an answer as well.
It's something for us to follow up on if it hasn't occurred.
No discussions related to this project. I think VTA, through a different effort, is engaged in them and trying to understand how they use VTA facilities to avoid conflicts, but that has not yielded anything for this study.
So I will add that we do talk to them on a regular basis about a number of issues, some of which are specific to Mountain View, but we do engage with their staff periodically. We know each other. We're engaging with them for the Diridon project, for other things as well.
Sure.
So we do have contact with them, and we do share information and ideas. And you know, if there's an opportunity to have a solution where the corporate shuttles can contribute to and be beneficiaries of projects that we do in the future, we certainly welcome that partnership.
Thank you for helping me with that. And I'll just make a quick announcement if we're on to number 10.
Okay, I just want to follow, for you, I came across Jason, the director with, he got promoted up at Apple.
Yes.
So we've had started a dialogue with him. We also I've met with Rod Diridon Jr. About what we could do with Apple. So we are doing conversations with them, and we're going to get them to be part of the solution. And so they've been open to listening to us so far.
You're right. No, we got that very clearly in a letter dated July 30th, and just following up. Thank you.
Yeah, no. And also, along with what Director Bruin said and what I was mentioning earlier, we have a lot of data, and so that data will help us form a route so we can start farming that information, and that will help us determine how the various stops and will be working. One thing that Jason, and I'm sorry I don't remember his last name, is that what's important to the big corporations is that minimum of transfers is important to them, and that's what we got to look at. Okay, seeing that item closed, we will go to item 10 for announcements. And I will go to Director Sinks.
Well, fortunately our Public Works Director is in the audience, and we were able to get the air conditioning to the dais here shut down. I apologize that everybody was freezing for the last hour and a half, and we'll try to rectify that for our morning meetings in the future.
Okay.
Thank you.
The fire is going on this side. Any other announcements from anybody else? Okay, I have one that I was fortunate. I was invited by the VTA General Manager to attend APTA, American Public Transit Association, in Washington, D.C. a couple of weeks ago, and it was very enlightening. Again, there's a lot going on out in the United States, and I think even though we're in Silicon Valley, we think we're moving pretty quick, but I think there's a lot other parts of the nation are moving as fast or quicker on us. And so it was good to talk to a lot of GMs about what they were doing and to learn best practices and get those lines of dialogue going so that we can work with each other to improve items. But it was a very good event, and I learned a lot from it. And if you have an opportunity to go, or even if you have an opportunity to go to the National League of Cities conferences or the California League of Cities conferences to their transportation, this is all type of information they're talking about how to improve transit and what works best. So that was my one announcement. Other than that, I'm glad to see everybody here, and I will make adjournment to March of 2019. So everybody have a happy holidays, and thank you so much. And again, thank you for staff for bringing in items that will expedite our decision-making process as we move forward. Well worth it.